The Americans, Chapter 16, Life at the Turn of the 20th Century, Section 3, Segregation and Discrimination. Born into slavery shortly before emancipation, Ida B. Wells moved to Memphis in the early 1880s to work as a teacher. She later became an editor of a local paper. Racial justice was a persistent theme in Wells' reporting. The events of March 9, 1892, turned that theme into a crusade. 3 African-American businessmen, friends of Wells, were lynched, illegally executed without trial. Wells saw lynching for what it was, a personal voice, Ida B. Wells. Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Lee Stewart had been lynched in Memphis, where no lynching had taken place before. This is what opened my eyes to what lynching really was, an excuse to get rid of Negroes who were acquiring wealth and property, and thus keep the race terrorized. African Americans were not the only group to experience violence and racial discrimination. Native Americans, Mexican residents, and Chinese immigrants also encountered bitter forms of oppression, particularly in the American West. Part 1. African Americans fight legal discrimination. As African Americans exercised their newly won political and social rights during Reconstruction, they faced hostile and often violent opposition from whites. African Americans eventually fell victim to laws restricting their civil rights, but never stopped fighting for equality. For at least 10 years after the end of Reconstruction in 1877, African Americans in the South continued to vote and occasionally to hold political office. By the turn of the 20th century, however, Southern states had adopted a broad system of legal policies of racial discrimination and devised methods to weaken African American political power. Voting restrictions. All Southern states imposed new voting restrictions and denied legal equality to African Americans. Some states, for example, limited the vote to people who could read and required registration officials to administer a literacy test to test reading. Blacks trying to vote were often asked more difficult questions than whites or given a test in a foreign language. Officials could pass or fail applicants as they wished. Another requirement was the poll tax, an annual tax that had to be paid before qualifying to vote. Black as well as white sharecroppers were often too poor to pay the poll tax. To reinstate white voters who may have failed the literacy test or could not pay the poll tax, several Southern states added the grandfather clause to their constitutions. The clause stated that even if a man failed the literacy test or could not afford the poll tax, he was still entitled to vote if he, his father, or his grandfather had been eligible to vote before January 1, 1867. The date is important because before that time, freed slaves did not have the right to vote. The grandfather clause, therefore, did not allow them to vote. Jim Crow laws. During the 1870s and 1880s, the Supreme Court failed to overturn the poll tax or the grandfather clause, even though the laws undermined all federal protections for African American civil rights. At the same time that blacks lost voting rights, Southern states passed racial segregation laws to separate white and black people in public and private facilities. These laws came to be known as Jim Crow laws, after a popular old minstrel song that ended in the words, "Jump Jim Crow." Racial segregation was put into effect in schools, hospitals, parks, and transportation systems throughout the South. Plessy versus Ferguson. Eventually, a legal case reached the U.S. Supreme Court to test the constitutionality of segregation. In 1896, in Plessy v. Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruled that the separation of races in public accommodations was legal and did not violate the 14th Amendment. The decision established the doctrine of separate but equal, which allowed states to maintain segregated facilities for blacks and whites as long as they provided equal service. The decision permitted legalized racial segregation for almost 60 years. See Plessy v. Ferguson, page 496. Turn of the Century Race Relations, Part 2. African Americans faced not only formal discrimination, but also informal rules and customs called racial etiquette that regulated relationships between whites and blacks. Usually, these customs belittled and humiliated African Americans, enforcing their second-class status. For example, blacks and whites never shook hands, since shaking hands would have implied equality. Blacks also had to yield the sidewalk to white pedestrians, and black men always had to remove their hats for whites. Some moderate reformers, like Booker T. Washington, earned support from whites. Washington suggested that whites and blacks work together for social progress. A personal voice, Booker T. Washington. To those of the white race, I would repeat what I say to my own race. Cast down your bucket among these people who have, without strikes and labor wars, tilled your fields, cleared your forests, builded your railroads and cities, and brought forth treasures from the bowels of the earth. In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hands in all things essential to mutual progress. Washington hoped that improving the economic skills of African Americans would pave the way for long-term gains. People like Ida B. Wells and W.E.B. Du Bois, however, thought that the problems of inequality were too urgent to postpone. Violence. African Americans and others who did not follow the racial etiquette could face severe punishment or death. All too often, blacks who were accused of violating the etiquette were lynched. Between 1882 and 1892, more than 1,400 African American men and women were shot, burned, or hanged without trial in the South. Lynching peaked in the 1880s and 1890s, but continued well into the 20th century. Discrimination in the North. Most African Americans lived in the segregated South, but by 1900 a number of blacks had moved to northern cities. Many blacks migrated to northern cities in search of better paying jobs and social equality. But after their arrival, African Americans found that there was racial discrimination in the North as well. African Americans found themselves forced into segregated neighborhoods. They also faced discrimination in the workplace. Labor unions often discouraged black membership, and employers hired African American labor only as a last resort and fired blacks before white employees. Sometimes the competition between African Americans and working-class whites became violent, as in the New York City race riot of 1900. Violence erupted after a young black man, believing that his wife was being mistreated by a white policeman, killed the policeman. Word of the killing spread, and whites retaliated by attacking blacks. Northern blacks, however, were not alone in facing discrimination. Non-whites in the West also faced oppression. Part 3. Discrimination in the West. Western communities were home to people of many backgrounds working and living side by side. Native Americans still lived in the Western territories claimed by the United States. Asian immigrants went to America's Pacific coast in search of wealth and work. Mexicans continued to inhabit the American Southwest. African Americans were also present, especially in former slaveholding areas such as Texas. Still, racial tensions often made life difficult. Mexican workers. In the late 1800s, the railroads hired more Mexicans than members of any other ethnic group to construct rail lines in the Southwest. Mexicans were accustomed to the region's hot, dry climate, but the work was grueling, and the railroads made them work for less money than other ethnic groups. Mexicans were also vital to the development of mining and agriculture in the Southwest. When the 1902 National Reclamation Act gave government assistance for irrigation projects, many Southwest desert areas bloomed. Mexican workers became the major labor force in the agricultural industries of the region. Some Mexicans, however, as well as African Americans in the Southwest, were forced into debt peonage, a system that bound laborers into slavery in order to work off a debt to the employer. Not until 1911 did the Supreme Court declare involuntary peonage a violation of the 13th Amendment, excluding the Chinese. By 1880, more than 100,000 Chinese immigrants lived in the United States. White people's fear of job competition with the Chinese immigrants often pushed the Chinese into segregated schools and neighborhoods. Strong opposition to Chinese immigration developed, and not only in the West. See Chinese Exclusion Act, page 465. Racial discrimination posed terrible legal and economic problems for non-whites throughout the United States at the turn of the century. More people, however, whites in particular, had leisure time for new recreational activities, as well as money to spend on a growing array of consumer products.